Have you ever faced a decision so monumental that it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, where one step forward could lead to a great victory or a devastating fall? A choice that promised to right a terrible wrong, but risked everything you held dear. This is the story of Europe, a continent at a crossroads, grappling with a challenge that will define its future for generations to come. It's a story of courage, of conviction, and of a desperate gamble with a price tag of $238 billion. But what if the path to justice, the very road paved with good intentions, leads not to triumph, but to a trap? When the drums of war began to beat on its eastern flank, the European Union stood up, defiant and united. It made a bold proclamation, a declaration of its values. It would sever its dependence on Russian gas, a lifeline that had fueled its industries for decades. In response, Russia's warning was chilling and direct. The EU would pay a heavy price. It was a David and Goliath moment, a continent standing for its principles against a formidable adversary. The spirit of unity was palpable, the desire to support Ukraine undeniable. Europe was ready to endure hardship, to weather the storm, for a cause it believed was just. This was its moment to prove its strength. In this high-stakes confrontation, EU believed it held a powerful card, an estimated 200 billion euros in frozen Russian assets, a vast treasure trove of bonds, deposits, and other securities held within its borders, primarily by the financial giant Euroclear. The idea was as bold as it was simple. Why not use the aggressor's own money to rebuild what they had destroyed? To take these frozen funds and funnel them to Ukraine as compensation, as a form of poetic justice. It felt like a masterstroke, a way to make Russia pay for the devastation it had caused, a path to hold it accountable. It was a narrative of empowerment, of turning the tables on a powerful foe. But the journey to justice is rarely a straight line. As the initial euphoria of this bold plan began to settle, a chorus of cautionary voices emerged from within the EU itself. Nations like Belgium, home to Euroclear, began to express deep reservations. They weren't questioning the moral imperative to help Ukraine, but the practical and legal reality of the plan. They feared a legal labyrinth, a quagmire of international law that could take years, even decades, to navigate. The very act of confiscating a sovereign nation's assets, they argued, could shatter the bedrock of trust upon which the global financial system is built. It risked triggering a chain reaction of lawsuits, and should the EU lose, it would be European taxpayers footing the colossal bill for legal costs and damages. The hero's weapon, it seemed, was double-edged. The complexity of the situation deepened. The assumption was that freezing these assets would cripple the Russian economy, bringing it to its knees and forcing a retreat. But the reality on the ground told a different story. While 200 billion euros is a staggering sum, it represented only a fraction of Russia's overall wealth. Its economy, bolstered by vast reserves of gold and other real assets, proved more resilient than anticipated. The financial blow, while significant, was not the knockout punch the EU had hoped for. This raised a daunting question. If Russia wasn't on the verge of collapse, if its defeat was not a certainty, on what grounds could the EU demand war reparations? The very concept of reparations is historically tied to a defeated power admitting culpability and paying for damages. But in this unfolding conflict with the outcome far from certain, demanding reparations felt premature, even presumptuous. The legal and political risks were immense. If the war were to end and Russia were to participate in Ukraine's reconstruction, it would likely be framed as reconstruction assistance, a diplomatic and economic tool, not a punitive payment. The distinction is crucial. One is an act of goodwill, the other an admission of guilt. The path of forced confiscation for reparations seemed to lead to a dead end, a journey with almost zero probability of reaching its destination. Europe's noble quest was hitting a wall of international realpolitik. Faced with these mounting legal and practical hurdles, the EU's approach began to look less like a calculated strategy and more like a desperate, hasty gamble. Why the rush? Perhaps it was a tactic to increase its leverage in future negotiations, a way to create political pressure on Moscow. But this aggressive posture was forcing the EU into a precarious position, one where it might have to pay its own tax. The foundational principle of Western economies, the protection of private property and capital, was now at risk. How could the EU champion this principle on one hand, while on the other hand moving to confiscate the assets, bonds, and private property of another nation? No matter how egregious that nation's actions, to do so would require bending, if not outright breaking, its own laws. It was a journey into a moral and legal gray zone, a path that could erode the very values Europe sought to defend. And Russia was watching, waiting. The response was not long in coming. Moscow issued a stark and unequivocal warning. If the EU moved to confiscate its assets, it would retaliate in kind. Russia would be prepared to freeze and potentially nationalize the billions of euros in assets held by European companies and individuals within its borders. The EU's bold move was no longer just a legal risk. It had become a direct economic threat. The attempt to turn Russia's assets into a weapon for Ukraine was now threatening to turn European assets in Russia into hostages. The tables were turning in a way no one had anticipated. This is the heart of the dilemma, the crux of the $238 billion bomb. The EU's grand strategy, born from a desire to punish an aggressor and support a friend, was backfiring in spectacular fashion. The efforts to cut off Russian gas and confiscate its assets were not bringing the intended advantages. Instead, they were transforming the EU into an energy and financial hostage. The heavy price that Russia had warned of was not being paid by the Kremlin, but by ordinary European citizens facing crippling energy costs. It was being paid by businesses, large and small, struggling with soaring inflation and an uncertain economic future. The grand gesture of defiance was inadvertently causing the most harm to the very people it was meant to protect. The goal of punishing Russia remained elusive, and the effectiveness of supporting Ukraine through this specific means was now shrouded in doubt. The continent, which had set out on a journey of moral clarity and strength, found itself ensnared in a web of its own making. The strategy of confiscating Russian assets for war reparations had not only run into a wall of legal risk and the threat of Russian retaliation, but it was also beginning to inflict more economic, financial, and political damage on the EU itself than it was on its intended target. The path to victory was proving to be a path of self-inflicted wounds. This is not a story of failure, but a story of a profound and difficult lesson. It is the story of a continent that dared to take a stand, but discovered that the battlefield of the 21st century is fought not just with soldiers, but with sanctions, assets, and energy pipelines. It learned that in a globally interconnected world, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And sometimes, the greatest cost is borne not by the enemy, but by oneself. The journey to overcome this challenge is far from over. Europe's greatest test now lies not in its ability to punish its adversary, but in its wisdom to navigate the consequences of its own choices to find a new path that safeguards its people, upholds its values, and secures its future. The $238 billion question remains, but the answer will be found not in a single dramatic act, but in the resilience, unity, and courage to adapt and endure, no matter how high the price of freedom may be.